Kilcoursey, the Unsolved Murder of Father Niall Molloy. On the evening of Sunday, the 7th of July, 1985, three good friends, Richard Flynn, his wife Teresa, and Father Niall Molloy shared drinks together in the master bedroom of the Flynn's home, Kilcoursey House, just outside Clara, County Offaly. Before sunrise the following morning, Father Niall Molloy would lie dead. The culprit made a full admission. However, the Molloy family's 40-year search for truth and justice had only just begun. In this episode, despite the heartbreaking loss of a beloved family member, the Molloys press on with their civil case against the Flynns. As the second anniversary of Father Niall's death approaches, Today Tonight exposes shocking revelations of deliberate evidence suppression during the inquest. Episode 5. Continue on the fight. After the inquest concluded, the news cycle moved on, as is always the case. The verdict delivered at the inquest seemed to quell the disquiet that was in the air after the criminal trial. In certain respects, the Molloys were vindicated by the verdict, but for them, there were still many unresolved issues and unanswered questions. Liam Lycett was still ignoring the Molloys' requests for any information in relation to Father Niall's partnership with Teresa. It was proving very difficult to locate any of Father Niall's financial records prior to 1985. William Malloy believed that the burglary of Father Niall's house also compounded the problem. After the inquest, the Molloy family began the process of issuing civil proceedings against Richard Flynn. On the 17th of February 1987, Ireland held a general election. The coalition government of Fine Gael and the Labour Party lost the election to Fianna Fáil. Fianna Fáil won just enough seats to form a minority government. On March 10th, a vote was held to elect a new Taoiseach. Charlie Haughey, who had twice served as a Fianna Fáil Taoiseach, was proposed by Brian Lenihan Sr. and then seconded by Jerry Collins, both Fianna Fáil ministers. There was a tied vote for and against Mr. Haughey, so the Ceann Comhairle cast the deciding vote in Mr. Haughey's favour. Charlie Haughey was then appointed Taoiseach for the third time by President Hillary. As for the ministers who proposed Mr. Haughey, Brian Lenihan Sr. was then appointed as his Taoiseach and his Minister for Foreign Affairs, while Jerry Collins became his new Minister for Justice. For Jerry Collins, this was his second outing as Minister for Justice in a Fianna Fáil government. He had previously served from July 1977 to June 1981 under Jack Lynch and Charlie Haughey before. Under the previous Fine Gael government, led by Gareth Fitzgerald, the national debt had doubled. Charlie Haughey had to implement severe budget cuts in all government departments at a time when the economy was already going through a recession. Ironically, despite the cutbacks, Mr. Haughey had no problem paying nearly £16,000 on handmade shirts from the French company Charvet while he was in office. Of course, this would only come to light after he had left his tenure and during a tribunal into certain payments he had received while he was Taoiseach. The Irish tax system was also overhauled, and Richard Flynn would be one of the first to feel the impact of the new revenue commissioners at work. As a result of the general election, the main opposition party, Fine Gael, also chose a new leader for their party. The previous Minister for Justice, Mr. Alan Dukes, became leader of the opposition. The Malloy family were now confronted with their third Minister for Justice since Father Niall was killed. Not long after the inquest, the confidential post office box opened by the Malloy family produced more anonymous letters. Some letters were vile with threats and abuse directed towards the Malloys and William in particular. Most were messages of encouragement and support. One anonymous letter they received captured the Malloys' attention. The author of the letter mostly refers to Dr. O'Sullivan's wife and her untimely death soon after Father Niall's. Despite this, William and the Malloy family felt the letter was still significant. The Malloy family have published the letter on the Family Campaign for Justice for Father Niall Molloy website. Names of persons still alive or any of their identifying details are redacted. The letter reads, Mr. Molloy, I sympathise with you on the death of Father Molloy. There is a lot of mystery surrounding this case, including the sudden death of the doctor's wife, who died 10 days after opening her heart about the terrible mess that night of the murder, all the blood that had to be cleaned up. She said, I shudder to think what went on that night, and the doctor would not get out of this jam as easy as he got out of the last one. Redacted, committed the act and, redacted, took the rap and, if charged, was going to plead on the grounds of diminished responsibility. The doctor's wife died rather quickly with a certain bit of mystery to it. She was not sick before, and she stated in Clara that she hoped she would not be around when the case came up. The next few lines are then redacted. It goes on. The local guards were not let near the place. Both administration and hierarchy interfered in suppressing evidence, and it brings them into disrepute. A complete whitewash job. The room was like a slaughterhouse with the mess that was in it. There's a lot of whispering going on all over the countryside. The whole talk is that, redacted, committed the murder. They were going to dump the body into the river, but there were drunken merrymakers around, so they had to drag the body upstairs. That is how the stair carpeting got so much bloodstains on it. The remainder of this letter is redacted. In April 1987, RTE's Today Tonight programme aired a 40-minute investigative piece on the circumstances surrounding Father Niall's death. This would be the first time the facts of the case were examined and the evidence was questioned in a documentary-style programme. The show's host, Olivia O'Leary, opened by asking if evidence was deliberately withheld from the coroner's inquest. Today Tonight's research team conducted quite an impressive investigation which still stands today. The investigative reporter, Gary Agnew, claimed that Today Tonight had uncovered new evidence about the circumstances surrounding Father Niall's death. They had identified substantial conflicts in statements between the Flynns and the independent witnesses in the case. These conflicts related to people's whereabouts during a 3-hour period on the evening of the 7th of July 1985. In addition to these claims, Today Tonight also alleged that a piece of evidence was overlooked by the Gardaí in their investigation, and statements relating to that evidence were suppressed. Their investigation and examination of the business dealings between the Flynns and Father Niall also found that lies were told and the full facts were withheld. Using still photographs and archive footage, the programme began by giving a background on Father Niall and his relationship with the Flynns. They also told the various stories of Father Niall not looking forward to the wedding in Kilcoursey and not quite being himself before he died. They outlined, according to the official statements, a timeline of people's movements on the evening of Sunday, the 7th of July, into Monday, the 8th of July, 1985. From the visit to the good bodies earlier in the evening to the arrival of the Garda Technical Bureau on the Monday morning, Today Tonight highlighted everyone's movements. A scale model of Kilcoursey House, with a cutaway wall showing the layout of the master bedroom, was constructed to help illustrate what Gardaí and Dr. Harbison had observed on their arrival. They would list the facial injuries Dr. Harbison noted in his post-mortem report and described his conclusion as to the cause of death being straightforward. Dr. Harbison determined that the acute swelling of the brain and head injuries caused Father Niall's death by blows to the head and principally to the face, 5, 6 or more blows by a fist. There could have been even more blows delivered to the same injury sites repeatedly. Dr. Harbison found no offensive or defensive wounds on Father Niall's hands or arms, and he stated in his evidence, quote, "There was no fight here. There was no signs of a struggle," end quote. A detailed summary of the trial was delivered, and just how Justice Rowe reached his controversial decision was explained. In summarising the inquest, Mr. Agnew pointed out the conflict between Dr. O'Sullivan's evidence and Richard's evidence of where the fight began. Also, the conflicting evidence Dr. O'Sullivan gave of being told by Richard that when he hit Father Niall, he fell, and when Father Niall got up, Richard hit him again, all of which Richard later denied. They explained that due to memory lapses, Teresa and Richard's evidence did very little to clarify many things about the case. The programme quoted the coroner, in his summation to the jury, that the full facts had not emerged as to what had happened the night Father Niall died. This opening section of the programme concluded by explaining the verdict delivered by the jury. It was pointed out that the previously unheard evidence at the inquest had disproved all 4 arguments that had led to Richard's acquittal. The next section of the Today Tonight programme would be titled Conflict of Evidence. Viewers were told that none of the members of the Flynn family gave statements to the Gardaí, but that a week after Father Niall was killed, their solicitor, Liam Lysett, handed over prepared statements. All the timings in the statements mostly correspond, but there was a substantial conflict of evidence between what the Flynns said in their statements compared to what the independent witnesses said. Today Tonight would provide examples of certain times that evening that were in conflict. 9:45 p.m. was the time the Flynns claimed Richard, Teresa and Father Niall, while on their way home from the Goodbodies, met the younger Flynns and guests on their way to the pub. However, an independent witness, James Lowry, claimed to have met Teresa as she was making herself a cup of tea in Kilcoursey House at 9:20 p.m. This would also conflict with the statement of another independent witness, Douglas Goodbody. He gave evidence that the Flynns and Father Niall also left his home for the 5-minute drive back to Kilcoursey at about 9:20 p.m. Another example of a conflict in the timeline was in relation to when the younger Flynns went to and left White's pub that night. Independent witness Dennis Hochter stated the group reached White's pub by 9:30 p.m. Yet according to the younger Flynns, they still had to bump into Richard, Teresa and Father Niall heading home from the Goodbodies at about 9:45 p.m. Maureen Flynn gave evidence at the trial that the group left White's pub at around midnight, but the owners of the pub confirmed they closed early that Sunday night, which should have been between 10 and 10:30 p.m. The time of 1 a.m. was the last example they gave of a conflict in the timeline. All the younger Flynns claimed they returned to Kilcoursey from their night out and that Father Duignan was pulling his car in behind them as they arrived at 1 a.m. Father Duignan stated he returned to Kilcoursey and dashed past the younger Flynns at the door after getting his glasses at 1:30 a.m. Dennis Hochter said he drove from David's house in Tubber to Kilcoursey House that night as he and his wife were due to stay as guests. He also stated they arrived at Kilcoursey at 1:30 a.m. These conflicts have never been fully explained. The next part of the programme would be titled Suppression of evidence. Mr. Agnew told viewers that on the 3rd of July 1986, just 2 weeks after Richard was acquitted, Today Tonight aired a programme that highlighted a number of key questions left unanswered at the trial. Garda sources at that time told Today Tonight that Father Niall's watch had been in good working order when it was handed back to the Malloys. The research carried out by the programme would uncover suppression of evidence at the inquest, specifically the suppression of additional statements the Gardaí were asked to write by an assistant Garda commissioner. 3 of these additional statements written by Technical Bureau Gardaí all agreed that the watch was working at the post-mortem. It would transpire that these 3 additional statements by the Dublin-based Gardaí were never in fact presented to the Molloy family's legal team when they were given the Garda file. The coroner was provided with copies, but the first the Molloys or their legal counsel knew of these statements was at the inquest, when they were read aloud by the Gardaí who wrote them. The same Assistant Garda Commissioner also requested additional statements from 2 Clara Gardaí in relation to the watch while in their custody. One of these local guards in his statement indicated that the watch was damaged at the time of the post-mortem, and the other that the watch was damaged before it was handed back to the Molloys. At the inquest, they both took the stand and gave evidence that the glass on the watch was broken, but neither would confirm that the watch had stopped. Of the 5 additional statements made about the watch, only the 3 from the Dublin-based Gardaí who mentioned the watch was working were passed along to the coroner as part of the Garda file. The 2 statements from the Clara Gardaí, which indicated the glass of the watch was damaged, were never passed to the coroner. Today Tonight claimed that they were suppressed. The next section of the programme dealt with the omission of evidence. Mr. Agnew repeated their allegations of the suppression of the additional statements about the watch. He explained that the coroner's file was missing 2 statements. All 5 statements were missing from the file given to the Molloy's legal team before the inquest. Gary Agnew interviewed the Molloy family solicitor Ben O'Rafferty on camera in his practice in Dublin. He asked, "How do you feel about the fact that these key statements simply did not appear at the inquest?" "Very unhappy, to put it mildly. It obviously would have broadened the scope of the inquest and the basic investigation a great deal had these statements been available." Today Tonight would be the first programme to publicly air the details of Father Niall and Teresa's business dealings and Richard's financial difficulties. The trial did not touch upon any of the financial dealings. Neither were they raised at the inquest because Father Niall and Teresa's partnership seemingly did not relate to the how, where and when Father Niall died. The next section of the programme would be titled Business. Today Tonight proceeded to highlight Father Niall and Teresa's business deals, and they would uncover some new information in relation to another previously unknown land deal. Father Niall and Teresa had built up substantial business interests between 1972 and when he was killed in 1985. The main aspect of their business was the buying and selling of show-jumping horses. Today Tonight found that at least 8 of the jointly owned horses remained at Kilcoursey. It was estimated that the combined value of the horses in the stables of Kilcoursey when Father Niall died was around £70,000. Images of cheques drawn down from Father Niall and Teresa's joint bank accounts in Moate, Athlone, Roscommon and Dublin were shown on the screen. They also each had personal accounts as well as owning shares in UK and Irish companies. Newly uncovered would be details relating to a land deal Father Niall and Teresa undertook in November 1972. They bought a 70-acre farm in Moydrum on the outskirts of Athlone for £13,000. The intention was to graze horses on the land, but it was also bought as a speculative venture. The old farmhouse and land was less than a mile from the proposed £10 million Athlone bypass. It also consisted of bog reserves and sandpits with a right-of-way that could become quite valuable if subjected to a compulsory purchase to build the bypass. Today Tonight also discovered that between 1982 and 1985, the farmhouse and 26 acres of the land in Moydrum were sold in 3 separate lots for a total of £21,000. It would later be reported in the papers that the sale of the 3 separate lots, plus a couple of acres bought by a local gun club, made a total of £31,000. The remaining 42 acres were still owned by Teresa and Father Niall. Because Father Niall's will could not be located, William Malloy, who was appointed as administrator of Father Niall's estate and next of kin, became a tenant in common with Teresa. This meant that they each legally owned a distinct half-share in the remaining land in Moydrum. Mr. Agnew then went on to explain that the Gardaí, during their initial investigation, became aware that business relations between Father Niall and the Flynns had become strained. Evidence Today Tonight claimed to have in their possession made it clear that Father Niall was concerned about an unsettled debt when he went to Kilcoursey on the weekend of the wedding. Today Tonight had learned that Mr. Egan from Fr and Merthyr Solicitors confirmed that Richard, Teresa and Father Niall had attended his office in September 1984 with a plan to buy land at Kilcoursey because Richard and David's car accessories business needed money fast. The agreed purchase price was £35,000, and Father Niall's half of the deposit of £12,000 was paid directly to Richard. Gardaí questioned Teresa Flynn in the presence of her solicitor on the 23rd of July 1985 in relation to the £12,000 deposit Father Niall had paid directly to Richard. Today Tonight alleged that evidence in their possession proved the reasons Teresa gave for the land deal to the Gardaí were false. Teresa admitted there was a deal but told the Gardaí that the plan was to extend the horse business and for Father Niall to build a small house for his retirement. She did not mention that the real reason for the land deal was due to Richard and David's financial difficulties. She also told the Gardaí that because planning permission was refused, 2 months before he died, she had repaid Father Niall £11,000 of the £12,000 in cash from a safe in Kilcoursey House, so he wouldn't be worrying. However, Teresa couldn't produce any proof she repaid any of the deposit to Father Niall, and her solicitor, Liam Lysett, also had to concede to the Gardaí that there was no documentary evidence to back up Teresa's claim. Today Tonight had learned that a few weeks before the wedding, Father Niall had gone to Fr and Merthyr's offices and expressed his concern about his unreturned deposit and his wanting to pursue it after the wedding. Because Fr and Merthyr acted for both him and Teresa, it was suggested that Father Niall should seek advice from an independent solicitor about pursuing his concerns. In the final section of the programme, Today Tonight would address Father Niall's will. Since Father Niall was killed, the Malloy family solicitor had been writing to Teresa and her solicitor, Liam Lysett, requesting details of the partnership's assets, but the requests were being ignored. It was pointed out that Teresa, through Liam Lysett, had actively been pursuing Father Niall's will. Letters stating that Teresa understood Father Niall's will contained directions to her as a beneficiary had been sent to the Bishop of Elphin, the 2 executors, and also to the Department of Defence because of Father Niall's time as an army chaplain. Mr. Agnew concluded by stating that Father Niall's family recently recovered his personal possessions, but they still did not know the extent of his estate. Footage was shown of Father Niall's nephew, Ian Maher, bundling clothes into the back of his car and items of clothing falling onto the ground. What the programme did not explain to viewers was the Molloy's requests for the return of Father Niall's personal belongings were constantly being ignored. The Molloys eventually threatened to turn up on the doorstep of Kilcoursey House to demand them back. This would trigger a call to tell them that they could collect Father Niall's personal possessions from Liam Lycett's office in Dublin. When Ian and Bill Maher arrived to collect them, Father Niall's clothes, photographs, riding gear, and a Bible had been left unceremoniously in a pile at the back door of the offices. The belongings had not been packed or boxed, and the two men, totally unprepared for this, did their best and brought out to the car as much as their arms could carry. Back in the studio, Olivia O'Leary told viewers that Today Tonight had asked Mr. and Mrs. Flynn to participate in the making of the programme, but they were advised not to do so by their solicitor. She also explained that the Garda Press Office had stated that an Assistant Garda Commissioner made an inquiry into the matter of Father Molloy's watch following the Today Tonight programme in 1986. 5 additional statements followed that inquiry and were forwarded to the law offices concerned with the inquest. The Gardaí totally refuted any suggestion of suppression. Miss O'Leary then concluded the programme by stating, "We still don't know why this evidence was not presented at the inquest." The law, as it stood at the time, did not allow for an appeal of Justice Rowe's direction to acquit Richard at the trial. Neither was there any provision in the law to call for a retrial. The Malloy family had previously appealed to the DPP to bring new charges, but this by and large fell on deaf ears. Because Richard was acquitted, he was protected by autor foi acquit, a form of double jeopardy in common law. In early May 1987, Ian would write to the Attorney General. In his letter he would state, "I would like to formally request you to consider appealing the decision of Mr. Justice Frank Rowe to the High Court, particularly in view of the findings of the inquest." Ian would never get a reply. The fight for justice William Malloy undertook on behalf of his brother had taken its toll on his health. William was admitted to hospital for a routine surgical procedure in May 1987. While lying on the trolley before he was brought to theatre, William took his nephew, Ian's hand, and told him to continue on the fight. On the 24th of May 1987, William Molloy, Father Niall's brother and champion for the Molloy family's fight for justice, died, aged 63. On the 5th of August 1987, the nephew of Father Niall and William, Ian, was consequently appointed administrator of Father Niall's estate in the High Court. The 8th of July 1987, the second anniversary of Father Niall's death. Anniversary Mass was held in Castlecoot Church and attended by Father Niall's family, friends, and parishioners. Martin Cahill was the most audacious criminal Irish authorities had ever encountered. A prolific burglar and armed robber, he ran a criminal gang on the south side of Dublin from the late 1970s until the 1990s. He was nicknamed the General because he planned his crimes with military precision. Martin Cahill didn't have much of an education apart from reform school, but he was cunning, highly intelligent, and constantly outwitted the Gardaí. In 1982, Martin Cahill was facing a lengthy prison sentence for armed robbery. He understood the important role forensic science played in obtaining convictions for the state, so he decided he would take extreme steps to help prevent his own incarceration. In January 1982, the senior forensic scientist to the Garda Technical Bureau, Dr. James O'Donovan, was targeted by a car bomb. It was discovered years later the general planted the bomb to try to eliminate the forensic scientist. Dr. O'Donovan lost half of one of his feet and suffered horrific, life-changing injuries, but he survived and astonishingly continued to work until he retired in 2002. The general and his gang were responsible for the largest heist in Irish history when in 1983 they robbed O'Connor's wholesale jewellers in Dublin of over £2 million in gold and jewels. He would also add extortion, kidnapping, and the second biggest art heist in the world to his list of crimes. On the night of Saturday, the 29th of August 1987, the general and 3 of his gang broke into the offices of the Director of Public Prosecutions, or the DPP, in St. Stephen's Green, Dublin. Instead of ransacking the place, the general took his time and consulted the index books so as to identify the exact files he was looking for. DPP files contain the book of evidence as it is presented in court, but they also include the Garda covering file, which is never made public, as this usually contains confidential findings made by the Gardaí during their investigations. Some of the files related to cases against Cahill and his gang, but others were taken because of their controversial nature and could be considered priceless in criminal circles. One file that piqued Martin Cahill's curiosity was the one the DPP had on Malcolm MacArthur. Cahill felt, because of MacArthur's entanglement with the Attorney General in his murder case, the file may hold information that could embarrass the authorities. The official number of files stolen was reportedly 145, while members of the gang themselves claimed there were over 300 files stolen. Regardless of how many files were actually stolen, Martin Cahill purposefully sought out Father Niall's file and included it in the stolen pile. According to Paul Williams in his book, The General, Irish Mob Boss, as well as stealing the files to show their utter contempt for the law, one of the gang defecated on the floor of the DPP's offices before they left. After Williams' untimely death, Ian did what was asked of him and continued on the fight. He tried to conduct his own investigation into the case. In his free time, Ian would regularly travel to Clara. He became a familiar sight in White's and the other pubs in the town. Ian never made any secret of who he was or that he was looking for information about the death of his uncle. He hoped that anyone with any knowledge of what had happened would be willing to talk to him. Ian didn't make much progress with the locals in Clara, other than being told whispers of the stories that had spread around the area. He heard a rumour that Kilcoursey House held many more occupants at the time of Father Niall's death than was officially claimed. According to this rumour, when Father Niall lay dying, the Flynns consulted with a solicitor over the phone. Apparently everyone bar Richard, Teresa and May were told to leave Kilcoursey House. Ian also heard that as well as Richard and Teresa, another person was involved in Father Niall's death and Richard was protecting them. These rumours echoed the contents of the anonymous letter the Malloys had received previously. Despite his best efforts, Ian could not determine if any of the rumours were indeed true. However, by poking around in the case, Ian and his family garnered some unwanted attention. When it was announced the Malloys were bringing a civil case against Richard, Ian began to receive intimidating phone calls. He started to notice strange cars parked outside his home. When he applied for planning permission to rebuild a house that had burnt down, he claimed that the local Fianna Fáil politicians kept blocking his applications. The civil claim over Father Niall's estate left the Malloys with 2 choices. They could pursue a claim for half the value of the assets of the partnership, plus 5% interest per annum since Father Niall died, or, alternatively, pursue half of the trading profits of the partnership. In order to decide which option to choose, it would be necessary to examine the accounts for Father Niall and Teresa's business. Since October 1985, the Malloys, through their solicitor, had been requesting the accounts for Father Niall and Teresa's partnership, but by 1987, they still had not received any response. Mr. Francie Kearns helped Father Niall and Teresa train and sell the horses. He was contacted by the Malloy's solicitor when they found out he received commission for selling Step-Aside just after Father Niall's death. Mr. Kearns replied in writing through his solicitor explaining that all the horses he stabled for Father Niall and Teresa were registered in Teresa's name only. He claimed Father Niall agreed to this because he felt it was not appropriate for a priest to engage in business. Mr. Kearns stated that it was not appropriate for him to discuss the sale of any of the horses with anyone other than Teresa Flynn. He did, however, advise the Malloy solicitor that Teresa had collected the livery account books for the horses in his care, as she claimed she was going to give them to her auditors. After 2 years, these accounts were still not forthcoming. Since Father Niall's death, Liam Lycett had ignored requests from the Malloy's solicitor for details pertaining to Father Niall and Teresa's partnership. Eventually, in a letter dated the 16th of September 1987, Mr. Lycett would go on to completely deny that he ever represented Father Niall. The letter read as follows: Re the estate of Father Niall Molloy, deceased. Dear Sirs, thank you for your letter of the 11th of September 1987. Father Niall was never a client of this firm, and we therefore have no documents, etc., relating to his affairs. We are not aware of any partnership composed of Father Malloy and Miss Teresa Flynn. If such is in existence, we never acted on behalf of it. Yours faithfully, Liam Lycett. In 1973, Professor Dermot Hourihan became the first professor of histopathology and morbid anatomy in Trinity College, Dublin. When he was 16, he was the youngest ever medical student to attend University College Dublin. Professor Hourihan was appointed as an associate professor in pathology in 1966 and played a large part in the Catholic Church lifting its 100-year ban on allowing Catholics to attend Trinity College in 1970. As well as lecturing in Trinity College, he was also a consultant histopathologist in St. James's Hospital in Dublin. Professor Hourihan would eventually go on to become the Dean of Trinity College and would advocate for medical and social change in Ireland. In early 1987, Professor Hourihan made contact with both Ian Maher and Ben O'Rafferty. He had been following the case in the media and offered to impart his expert opinion. Professor Hourihan was provided with the post-mortem report by Dr. Harbison, including the histological findings and slides, plus the transcripts of the medical evidence given at the inquest, and he set to work. He would revert to the Malloys once he had compiled a report based on his professional opinion. Professor Hourihan's report, dated the 20th of October 1987, was then given to Ben and the Malloys. Professor Hourihan agreed with Dr. Harbison's assessment of the cause of death being due to brain swelling from trauma and the resulting pulmonary oedema. He stated, "I have 2 additional opinions to offer which may be of relevance to any legal proceedings that may be taking place, and these are as follows. Number 1, that the anatomical evidence of injury, both external and internal, as described in Dr. Harbison's report, are very strongly suggestive that he received kicks in addition to punches with a fist. Number 2, that the evidence is also very suggestive that he lived for hours, rather than minutes, after the injuries were first received." Professor Hourihan pointed out that Dr. Harbison, during cross-examination, agreed that the injury to Father Niall's jaw was most likely caused by a shod foot. For the first time, the internal bleeding near Father Niall's collarbone was addressed when Professor Hourihan stated that he felt this injury was as a result of Father Niall being kicked rather than from a punch. He felt that the abrasion and graze near Father Niall's groin and the bleeding into the stalk of his kidney were also strongly suggestive of Father Niall having received kicks while lying on the floor. On examination of the histopathology slides, Professor Hurahan found pathological proof that Father Niall had taken hours to die. He pointed out that a thin layer of blood which had accumulated and clotted on both sides of Father Niall's brain was an indication that his death was prolonged and not immediate, as the Flynns had tried to claim. When Ian took over as administrator of Father Niall's estate, he also took over the pursuit of the civil cases against the Flynns. A High Court action was being brought in relation to Father Niall and Teresa's partnership and Father Niall's assets. The Malloys were also suing Richard for damages in the Circuit Court arising from Father Niall's death, plus the costs the Molloy family incurred during the inquest. In a separate case, they also issued Circuit Court proceedings against Richard for the £12,000 deposit Teresa claimed to have repaid Father Niall without providing any proof of having done so. November 1987 was not a good month for the Flynns. On Monday, the 2nd of November 1987, Barclays Bank, the mortgage lender for Kilcoursey House, registered a charge against Richard for £230,000. This entitled Barclays to repossess the property if the mortgage repayments were not met. By mid-November, the Revenue Commissioners had also caught up with Richard in the High Court. 3 judgments were awarded against him in relation to unpaid taxes on his businesses. £33,000 was awarded against Shane Inee, the coffee shop in the Athlone shopping centre Richard owned and Teresa ran. Over £31,000 was awarded against Rich Speed Auto Accessories, of which David was the director. The largest award, of over £60,000, was made against RKF Motor Factors, Richard's nationwide chain of shops. Richard was also found liable for the legal costs of £282 for each of the awards made against him. The total tax bill would exceed £126,000. The Flynns then decided to sell Kilcoursey House at auction. Their auctioneer placed a reserve of around £250,000, which was half of what the Flynns paid when they bought the house from the Goodbodies in 1981. Ian became aware of the upcoming auction, as did the parishioners of Castle Coote. Father Niall's former parishioners threatened to demonstrate at the auction and to obstruct the sale. Meanwhile, Ian obtained a lis pendens on the deeds to Kilcoursey House, making it compulsory for any potential buyer to be informed that there was litigation pending against the property. These efforts would put potential buyers off, so the house was removed from the auction listing and the for sale advert posted in the Wall Street Journal was not renewed. Ian also obtained a writ in the High Court preventing the Flynns from selling Kilcoursey House at private treaty until the civil cases pending against the Flynns could be heard in the Circuit Court. It was while the writ was being granted in the High Court that Liam Lycett, out of the blue, informed the Malloy's solicitor that he was no longer acting on behalf of the Flynn family. Mr. Lycett, however, still maintained that Father Niall was never a client of his, and he was unaware of any partnership that had existed between Father Niall and Teresa. The Malloys would eventually find evidence to the contrary. The new solicitors representing the Flynns, Carter, Smith and Company, took a different approach than Mr. Lycett to the requests for information about Father Niall's possessions and assets. Instead of stonewalling just before Christmas, on the 23rd of December 1987, he wrote on behalf of the Flynns to the solicitors acting for Father Niall's estate. The existence of a joint bank account in Father Niall and Teresa's name in the AIB in Dublin was finally acknowledged, but it was claimed that it held only a small amount of money. Ian's brother Bill owned an antique business in Dublin, and he had been making inquiries through his contacts. He found out that Father Niall was a regular attendee at an auction house in County Tipperary and had purchased at least 3 valuable paintings which he had hung in his room in Kilcoursey House. The letter from Carter Smith and Company stated that any of the paintings that were in Kilcoursey House at the time of Father Niall's death had, by this time, been given back to the Malloys. Teresa, through her new solicitor, insisted that 2 Jack Yates watercolours the Malloys had inquired about had been removed from Kilcoursey by Father Niall himself in 1983. The cattle Martin Malloy had bought on behalf of Father Niall just before the wedding were sold at a loss, according to the Flynns. They claimed the dealer who sold the cattle on their behalf had since died, and they didn't know what factory he sold them to, but they had documents that could prove the loss. 20 horses were listed as having been bought by the partnership since its inception. 6 were sold for a combined price of £60,000. The Flynns claimed 3 of the horses remained unsold. The rest had been sold with little or no profit, given away, put down, or died. Father Niall's thoroughbred show jumper Step-Aside was listed as one of those unsold. The solicitor for Father Niall's estate wrote back asking for clarification as to Step-Aside's current status, because they had been led to believe the horse had been sold. Carter Smith and Company replied and clarified that Step-Aside being listed as unsold was a writer's error. They admitted that the horse had indeed been sold. An explanation as to the sale of Step-Aside was then provided. The horse was sold at the RDS Horse Show in August 1985 for an agreed price of £20,000 to an Italian buyer. The Malloys knew Francie Kearns received £2,000 commission for the sale. However, the Flynns claimed that they only received an instalment of £7,000 from the Italian buyer. The vet in Dublin gave the horse a clean bill of health, but on arrival, when the Italian vet examined the horse, he allegedly found a heart defect, so the remainder of the money was never paid. Furthermore, the Flynns claimed that they were liable for vet's bills of between £7,000 to £10,000, so that they might even be out of pocket for the sale of the horse. They also claimed that, in fact, Father Niall owed Richard money, as his partnership with Teresa had undertaken to cover improvements to their business. The Flynns alleged that payments were outstanding to Richard for erecting stables, building a sand arena, and the cost of stabling horses. The Flynns were also claiming that Father Niall owed them £6,000 from the sale of another horse, a transaction that had been completed before Father Niall died. They alleged that Father Niall sold the horse and the money was mistakenly deposited into his own personal account and not into the joint bank account of their business. The Flynns were countersuing Father Niall's estate to get their £6,000 back. Solicitors for Father Niall's estate wrote to the vet in Dublin who examined Step-Aside before the horse was transported to Italy. They asked the vet to provide a breakdown of the fees he was charging the Flynns. The vet replied to inform them that the Flynns did not owe him any outstanding fees. Over the course of their partnership, the joint account in Father Niall and Teresa's name saw over £100,000 pass through it, but it was now all but depleted. This amount was probably an underestimation, as Teresa had previously admitted that quite a number of business transactions were carried out on a cash-only basis, and there was no record of them. There was also more than one joint account. The solicitor for Father Niall's estate provided the auditors of the Flynns' accounts with every document they had uncovered. The Flynns' auditors contacted the solicitors for Father Niall's estate in March 1988 to advise that their audit was completed and the accounts were finally ready. However, they would not be in a position to release the accounts until their clients, the Flynns, had paid their outstanding fees. On April 14, 1988, Richard Flynn was represented in the civil case for damages by his barrister, Mr. Dan Herbert. Richard did not attend the proceedings in the Circuit Court in Tullamore. The Malloys, as plaintiffs, were suing Richard for mental distress, legal expenses, and funeral costs. Richard's barrister, Mr. Herbert, did not dispute liability or contest the claim, but he did call into question the cost of the legal expenses the Malloys had incurred. Ian was being asked to justify hiring a legal team for the inquest. Ian explained that during their investigations and preparations for the inquest, they had consulted many eminent medical and forensic experts for their opinions. He told the court that the criminal trial had not established what had happened the night his uncle died. The Molloy family couldn't accept Father Niall had died from a heart attack. He would state, "I had seen my uncle's body. I'd seen some of the marks on it. I knew he didn't die of a heart attack, and I wanted that clarified. My uncle had been beaten to death, and we wanted to establish this at the inquest." Ian went on to state under cross-examination by Mr. Herbert that his uncle had not died intestate. Father Niall had made a will and had named two close friends, Mr. Pat McCann and Dr. Michael Dorman, as executors. But despite the efforts of the Molloy family, the will could not be found. The court also heard from Father Niall's sister, Susanna, who described the effect her brother's death had had on her. She told the court she was extremely close to her little brother. She had lost 2 stone in weight and was a nervous wreck since he was killed. Mr. Herbert acknowledged Susanna's intense grief. However, in an attempt to reduce the potential award for mental distress, Mr. Herbert argued that there was a difference between grief and mental distress. He claimed that the findings of the inquest would not have added to the Molloys' mental distress, as the coroner had no prosecutorial powers. He also went on to argue that while the Molloys could ask whomever they wanted to attend or testify at the inquest, the Coroner's Act did not extend to covering any costs they may have incurred. Justice Kevin O'Higgins delivered his judgment, reminding the court that this case was not a repeat of the criminal trial. He explained that as liability was not denied or contested in this case, his role was purely to assess the damages. After listening to all the evidence, he agreed that the Molloy family had suffered mental distress and awarded them £7,500 in damages. Justice O'Higgins also accepted that the Molloys' legal representation at the inquest was reasonable, proper, and a prudent course to take. He therefore awarded the Molloys £4,750 for their legal costs and a further £891 for funeral expenses. Richard was ordered to pay a total of £13,141. Ian took the case against Richard on behalf of Father Niall's sisters, Susanna, Eileen and Maureen, and they would be the beneficiaries of the award made by the Circuit Court. For the Molloys, it was never about the money. They had a right to recover their costs, but their main issue was with the way the Flynns had behaved towards them since Father Niall's death. Ian felt that had the Flynns made an effort to meet them, to explain what had happened, things would have taken a different course. It was only when the Flynns' new solicitor began corresponding with the Molloys in relation to Father Niall's assets, 2 years after Father Niall's death, that the Flynns asked for a meeting. The Molloys would decline. When asked for comment after the proceedings, Ian stated, "We're very pleased with the judgment today. For the first time, we've seen an admission of liability from Mr. Flynn for causing my uncle's death." But he also added, "There are no winners in this case." The day after winning the damages case against Richard, Ian received a letter from the Combined Insurance Company of Ireland's Claims Department. The letter explained that there was a policy on Father Niall's life and that they had received a letter back in August 1985 from Teresa Flynn trying to make a claim. This was the first anyone apart from the Flynn family or the insurance company knew that a life policy existed on Father Niall. The claims handler explained that he had replied to the letter from Teresa requesting documentation from the administrators and a death certificate, but he had heard nothing back. The insurers wanted to know what the relationship was between Teresa and Father Niall, as she had claimed on the policy to be his sister. Ian replied, explaining that there was no blood relationship between Father Niall and Teresa. The Combined Insurance Company issued the settlement of £1,500 to Father Niall's actual next of kin, Ian, who in turn donated it to Father Niall's parish in Castlecoot. Details of the insurance policy and attempted claim would be made public through investigations carried out by the Sunday Tribune. The Sunday Tribune enlisted a British handwriting expert, Mr. Mike Ansell, to carry out a handwriting analysis on the letter. He was also provided with 2 samples of Teresa Flynn's handwriting for comparisons. Mr. Ansell provided his professional opinion. Quote, "There are clear indications that the letter to the insurance company was not written by the writer of the other documents. It is not the same normal writing of the same person." End quote. When contacted that April by the Irish Independent newspaper and asked for comment, Teresa tearfully denied sending the letter or trying to make the claim. When David Flynn was also asked about the claim, he had no comment to make. Whoever wrote and sent the letter knew the policy existed, and they had the policy number. Ian Maher told the press that he hoped the insurance policy and the attempted claim would bring pressure on the Gardaí to reopen the case of his uncle's death. On the 27th of April 1988, the spokesman for the Workers' Party, Pat McCartan, demanded in the Dáil that a new investigation be carried out into the death of Father Niall. The Minister for Justice, Jerry Carroll, provided a written reply to this demand. In it, he said that no official complaint or additional evidence had been received by the Gardaí. Should such a complaint be made or additional evidence be produced, it would be considered. This then prompted the Garda Commissioner, Eamon Doherty, to publicly confirm that he would consider a new inquiry if an official complaint was made or if additional new evidence was made available. The 8th of July 1988, the 3rd anniversary of Father Niall's death. Anniversary Mass was held in Castlecoot Church and attended by Father Niall's family, friends and parishioners. Dr. John Dinn was a consultant neuropathologist in St. James's Hospital and also a senior lecturer in neuropathology at Trinity College Dublin. The Malloys gave Dr. Dinn all the medical evidence they had along with the transcripts, post-mortem report, slides and photos, and asked him to compile a report for a second opinion. On the 16th of September 1988, Dr. Dinn released his report to the Malloys. He agreed with both Dr. Harbison and Professor Hurahan as to Father Niall's cause of death. Dr. Dinn, however, went into much more detail as to the quantity of bleeding within the skull and its significance. He gave the opinion that this amount of blood would take more than 1 hour to accumulate. On examination of the histology slides, Dr. Dinn found evidence of histological changes in the brain that can take up to 3 hours to develop. He concluded that Father Niall could have been alive for up to 3 hours after he was beaten. Both the Minister for Justice and the Garda Commissioner had previously thrown down the gauntlet to the Malloys when they said they would consider reopening the case if new evidence was made available. On the 6th of October 1988, Ian, on behalf of the Malloy family, handed Professor Hurahan's and Dr. Din's reports over to the Gardaí. In 2013, Ian's son, Colin Maher, would write an article for broadsheet.ie titled "Who Will Rid Them of This Troublesome Priest?" In his article, he described what had happened when Ian gave the Gardaí the new evidence they had publicly invited. The article states, "When this report was handed into the Gardaí in October 1988, my father was told that this was crucial, important new evidence and that the case would be reopened. It contradicted the version of events given up to that time and proved that Niall had been viciously assaulted and left to die over a long period of time. However, within a number of days, the Gardaí called my father again to say that the case would not in fact be reopened. He was never told any reason for the sudden change of heart and was left very distraught at the situation." Ian would then appeal to Bishop Conway of Elphin and the head of the Catholic Church in Ireland, Cardinal O'Fiach, asking them to use their influence to help get the case reopened. Bishop Conway did not reply. When asked for comment by the Irish Independent, the Cardinal was not available, but a spokesperson stated it was a matter for the law and it was not really in the Cardinal's jurisdiction. This would be another devastating blow for the Molloy family in their fight for justice for Father Niall. The Irish Independent journalist, Tom Reddy, had gotten close to the Molloy family, and they had given him exclusive access to any new developments in the case. He was the first to bring the broken watch to the public's attention in print media. Tom was privy to a lot of information that was not yet in the public domain, which he was going to publish in his book on the case. Tom's book was titled The Death of Father Malloy. In autumn 1988, the book was launched in the historic Gresham Hotel in Dublin to some fanfare and publicity. It was being touted as a potential bestseller, especially with Christmas coming. A few days after the launch, the publishers, the Kerryman, announced that their lawyers had found potential legal problems with some aspects of the book. The publisher decided to put the distribution of the book on hold at that time. Apart from a few copies given to members of the Molloy family at the launch in the Gresham Hotel, the book never reached the shelves, and not one copy was ever sold to the public. Dr. Harbison's role in Father Niall's case was not yet over. Even though the Gardaí refused to reopen the case, they gave Dr. Harbison both Professor Hurahan's and Dr. Din's reports to review and asked for any comments he may have. Dr. Harbison released a report on the 3rd of March 1989. He stated that it was not unusual for Professor Hurahan and Dr. Din, who were instructed by the Malloys, to disagree with Dr. Gilsenan, medical expert at the inquest for the Flynns. In relation to the opinions as to how long it took Father Niall to die, he stated that he would allow the experts on both sides as much latitude as possible by agreeing to the possibility of conflicting views. He felt the opinions of the experts in neuropathology in relation to the time of death should be deferred to because he also consulted with an expert, Dr. Farrell of the Richmond, at the time of writing his original report. However, he still felt he would like to leave the widest possible latitude in this area. In reply to Professor Hurahan's allegations of Father Niall's injuries being caused by kicks rather than punches, Dr. Harbison stated that unless he found imprints of footwear on the skin, which he didn't find in Father Niall's case, he was unable to be certain that kicks were delivered. However, he stated that in his experience, fatal kicks to the chest usually caused fractured ribs, which Father Niall didn't have. Dr. Harbison concluded his report by stating that he had yet to review transcripts and consult with his esteemed colleagues for their opinions, but on the basis of what he had read, he felt the medical experts instructed by the Malloys produced reasonable alternative explanations, which he felt could have been possibilities. On the 15th of June 1989, Ireland held another general election. Mr. Haughey had overestimated his party's popularity. Fianna Fáil did not win enough seats for a majority. On the 12th of July 1989, Fianna Fáil formed a coalition government with the Progressive Democrats, with Charles Haughey being reappointed as Taoiseach. The Taoiseach appointed his Minister for Industry, Commerce and Communications, Ray Burke, to take on the additional role as his new Minister for Justice. In 1997, Ray Burke would be forced to resign from the Dáil and be judged to be corrupt after being found to have received £80,000 from a property developer to rezone agricultural land into development land while he worked for Dublin County Council. Fianna Fáil also pursued Minister Burke for the return of £30,000 of campaign funds he kept for himself. With the appointment of Ray Burke, the Malloy family were now dealing with their fourth Minister for Justice since Father Niall's death. The 8th of July 1989, the fourth anniversary of Father Niall's death. Anniversary Mass was held in Castlecoot Church and attended by Father Niall's family, friends and parishioners. On the 11th of October 1989, Dr. Harbison wrote an addendum to his report in response to the new medical findings from Professor Hourahan and Dr. Dinn. He had reviewed the pathology findings, transcripts, and had consulted with a senior neuropathologist. He and the senior neuropathologist concurred that the bleeding on the brain on its own could have easily occurred within an hour, but that this bleeding was less significant than the swelling of the brain. In their conclusion, they felt the extent of post-traumatic brain swelling Father Niall sustained could cause death in well under an hour. Dr. Dinn, in his report over a year earlier, noted changes in the neurons in Father Niall's brain slides. He gave the expert opinion that it required more than 1 hour between bleeding after the trauma and death for these changes to become visible under microscopic examination. Dr. Harbison conceded that he could not rebut this finding by Dr. Dinn. On the 9th of November 1990, Cathal Daly was appointed the new Primate of All Ireland and Archbishop of Armagh, replacing Thomas O'Fiach as head of the Catholic Church in Ireland. Sometime over Christmas 1990, heading into New Year 1991, the coroner's office in Tullamore was broken into. There was no mention by the Deputy Coroner, Mr. Brian Mahan, if anything had been stolen. The burglars trashed the office and started a fire, destroying some papers and files. Some of the cards of appreciation the Deputy Coroner received after the inquest had been destroyed in the fire, but according to Mr. Mahan, the actual coroner's inquest file had survived, undamaged. There were still 2 more civil cases pending as part of the Malloys' overall legal strategy. Richard was being sued for the £12,000 unreturned deposit in the Circuit Court, and this pending case was also preventing the sale of Kilcoursey House. In turn, the Flynns were countersuing the Malloys for £6,000 profit for the sale of a horse. There was also the pending High Court case against the Flynns in pursuit of Father Niall's possessions and half his business interests. The Malloys and their legal team had been compiling as much documentary and financial evidence as they could find in relation to what and where Father Niall's assets were. Apart from his personal effects, most of his possessions could not be located. They established that Father Niall's estate, which consisted of the paintings, horses, stocks and shares, plus savings and profits from the partnership, on paper would be worth approximately £200,000. But things got to a point where the legal cases began to take a toll. Ian had taken a redundancy package 2 years earlier, and his life had become completely consumed with the case. The time, effort and costs involved were mounting. Ian and the Malloy family decided they would discontinue the 2 remaining cases against the Flynns. Ian stated that he just wanted to get on with the rest of his life. He told one newspaper that he was considering selling his house, buying a pub, and becoming a publican. When the remaining cases against the Flynns were dropped by the Malloys, the lis pendens and the writ preventing the sale of Kilcoursey were removed. The Flynns finally managed to sell Kilcoursey House in 1991. Martin Cahill, aka the General, had been playing cat and mouse with the Gardaí and authorities all his adult life. Whenever he got the chance, the General took great delight in humiliating the Gardaí. He made sure word got back to the authorities that he had stolen the files from the DPP's office. He knew the Gardaí wouldn't dare pursue him while he had the files. Because of the highly sensitive nature of some of these files, the Gardaí were unsurprisingly most anxious to get them back. The files were a highly valuable commodity which the General intended to use to trade for something he wanted from the authorities. The General's friend and criminal associate, John Traynor, had been sentenced to prison in the UK for fraud in 1989. In early 1992, based on a tip-off, the Gardaí searched a disused laundrette in a rundown part of inner-city Dublin. The laundrette belonged to John Traynor. In the attic of this dilapidated building, the Gardaí found 60 of the stolen files from the DPP's office. Father Niall's file was not amongst them. 2 Gardaí travelled to the UK and interviewed Traynor in his top security prison about what they had found. Soon after the visit from the Gardaí, Traynor was transferred to an open prison in the UK. A few weeks later, John Traynor disappeared while on a weekend pass from his new open prison. When he arrived back in Ireland in November 1992, no attempt was made by the Irish authorities to send him back to the UK. In fact, John Traynor also had outstanding charges against him relating to an armed robbery he committed in Dublin before being imprisoned in the UK. Traynor, who the General didn't realise was also a Garda informer, brokered a deal between the General and the Gardaí for the return of Father Niall's file. Traynor arranged to meet a Garda detective he knew on the south side of Dublin one evening in January 1993. He walked the detective Garda around a few side streets when suddenly the General popped out from behind a hedge, holding a Dunnes Stores carrier bag. The General then handed the bag containing Father Niall's file to the detective Garda, but not before warning him that he had made 20 copies of the file and all were in safekeeping. Not long after the handover of the file, the charges John Traynor faced for armed robbery in Dublin were dropped. In 1992, Charlie Haughey's time as Taoiseach and leader of Fianna Fáil was starting to run out. The Fianna Fáil candidate for the presidential election and friend of the Flynns, Brian Lenihan Sr., was defeated by Mary Robinson, who would become the first female president of Ireland. This was a big political disappointment for Fianna Fáil. Mr. Haughey then faced a vote of no confidence, which he would win, but it would damage his standing in the party. The final straw came when Sean Doherty, who was Minister for Justice back in 1982, told RTE Television that Charlie Haughey knew about and had authorised the tapping of phones belonging to journalists. As Minister for Justice at the time, Sean Doherty took the blame for the scandal back in 1982, while insisting Mr. Haughey had no knowledge of the phone-tapping activities. But now, 10 years later, Sean Doherty delivered this stunning U-turn at a press conference. Because of this revelation, Charlie Haughey resigned as leader of Fianna Fáil and as Taoiseach. On the 11th of February 1992, Albert Reynolds, who had just been elected as the new leader of Fianna Fáil, also became the new Taoiseach. He appointed Pádraig Flynn as his new Minister for Justice. This would be the 5th Minister for Justice appointed since Father Niall died. In 2012, Pádraig Flynn would also resign in disgrace from Fianna Fáil when the Mahon Tribunal found out he had pocketed donations made to Fianna Fáil, some of which helped pay for a farm he bought in County Mayo. The Fianna Fáil Progressive Democrats coalition government Albert Reynolds took over would not last either. The coalition collapsed in November 1992, and on the 25th of November, a general election was held. Fianna Fáil had a terrible result, winning less than 40% of the vote, so they had to enter into coalition talks with other parties. Eventually, a new Fianna Fáil Labour Party coalition government was formed, and Albert Reynolds was appointed Taoiseach again in early 1993. Moira Geoghegan Quinn replaced Pádraig Flynn as Minister for Justice on the 4th of January. Now the Malloys were on to their 6th Minister for Justice since Father Niall's death. In spring of 1993, the outcome of a Law Society disciplinary case was published in their Gazette magazine. Re Liam Lysett, New Road, Clondalkin, Dublin 22, it reported that Mr. Lysett had been censored and fined for providing inaccurate and untrue communication to another firm of solicitors. On the 8th of March 1993, the acting president of the High Court ordered that Liam Lysett, solicitor, stand censured regarding his conduct as a solicitor and that he pay a fine to the Law Society in the sum of £500. The Law Society had found that the letter Liam Lysett sent to solicitors acting for Father Niall's estate in September 1987, stating there was no partnership and that he never acted for Father Niall, was inaccurate and untrue. During his investigations, Ian had uncovered that Mr. Lysett had in fact registered land on behalf of Father Niall and Teresa with the Land Commission. He had also left a paper trail and correspondence he sent to Farron Murtha's solicitors when he acted on behalf of that partnership. This proved that Mr. Lysett had acted for both Father Niall and Teresa despite his denials. When Ian obtained the proof he needed, he made a complaint to the Law Society Disciplinary Committee. Justice Costello, who heard the case, stated that Mr. Lysett's denials of acting for the partnership was not proper conduct for a solicitor to engage in. The judge reminded Mr. Lysett that the duties of a solicitor towards a client could not be clearer. Solicitors were not entitled to be inaccurate in their replies to a correspondence, and they should avoid making errors. As a result, the disciplinary committee found Liam Lysett guilty of professional misconduct. In court, Liam Lysett apologised for saying his firm had never acted for Father Malloy or the partnership. However, despite being faced with the proof of his lies, and after making his apology, he did not make any effort to redeem himself. Liam Lysett would never hand over any of the documents to the Malloys. Teresa Flynn would die of cancer in August 1993. After her funeral mass, she was laid to rest in the cemetery in Tuberclare, near Glasson, just outside Athlone, County Westmeath. On the 18th of August 1994, Garda radios all over Dublin buzzed with excitement when word came through that the General had been killed. He was shot dead through the side window of his car as he was stopped at a junction near his home on the south side of Dublin. A man in a high-vis vest, holding a clipboard and a gun, approached the car and fired through the glass. The car moved slowly across the road and came to a stop against some railings. The gunman followed the car, fired again, and then calmly got onto the back of a motorbike driven by an accomplice. Witnesses stated that the gunman was smiling as they left the scene. The IRA would later claim responsibility. Veronica Guerin was a journalist with the Independent Newspapers Group. She began her career as an accountant after finishing college, then began working in public relations and as an election agent for Fianna Fáil before she became a journalist for the Sunday Business Post. In 1994, Veronica began reporting on crime and criminal gangs for the Sunday Independent. She had numerous interviews with John Traynor, the General's old friend, and managed to obtain information from him about the contents of the DPP's file on Father Niall. Veronica would later manage to get her hands on a copy of the file, but she denied that it came from Traynor. On the 16th of October 1994, Veronica published an article in the Sunday Independent that would lead to 2 shots being fired through the front window of her home. For the first time, the public would read that the file on Father Niall was traded by the Gardaí for the release from a high-security prison of a criminal associate of the General's. The circumstances in which the Gardaí secured the return of the file was in itself a bombshell. Veronica also investigated the whereabouts of Father Niall's will and the claims that the bishop's office had received a copy. She interviewed a priest who confirmed that the will had been received in the offices of the diocese. He presumed if Teresa Flynn was named as a beneficiary in the will, the church probably would have thought the worst. The priest didn't know what the contents of the will were, but did not believe there had been any impropriety between Father Niall and Teresa. Veronica's article then went on to outline some of the contents of the file that would create huge controversy. She reported that the DPP's file on Father Niall contained 2 remarkable letters. The second letter was dated after the trial had taken place in 1986. She claimed that Justice Rowe wrote to the DPP to offer an explanation for the reasons behind his instructing the jury to find Richard Flynn not guilty. But it would be the first letter, a handwritten piece of correspondence allegedly from Justice Frank Rowe to the DPP, Mr. Eamon Barnes, that would create the most controversy. The Sunday Independent claimed that the handwriting could be identified as Justice Rowe's by comparing it to other examples of his handwriting. This letter was allegedly written and sent by the judge to the DPP before Richard Flynn was charged with assault and manslaughter back in August 1985. In his first letter to the DPP, Justice Rowe said that he personally knew the Flynns and Father Malloy. But Justice Rowe chose to hear the case anyway. For the first time, the public had been presented with an alternative motive for Father Niall's death. In the civil case, Richard Flynn did not contest liability and was ordered to compensate the Malloys. And the work undertaken by Veronica Guerin renews interest in the case. In episode 6, the Malloys sustained the devastating loss of another family member. An Irish independent investigation into the circumstances of Father Niall's death gains so much public attention that the government can no longer ignore the pressure to reopen the case. This series was written, produced and edited by Liv Kerwin. Narrated by Marcus Kerwin. Music, Take Up Your Cross by Unchenko Music. We would like to extend our very special thanks to Mr. Bill Maher and Father Niall's family. This series is dedicated to the memory of Joe, Matthew, and Tony. This has been a Kilcoursey production.